Hey YouTubes, despite the laundry list of fixes that I've thrown at this car, I still don't have it right. And it's not holding up mechanically very well to the power that this engine's making now. After doing 3 third-gear pulls trying to tune it, I parked it at a friend's house for about 10 minutes. As it sat, the driver's side wheel bearing became so hot that it cooked the hub and brake rotor, boiling my brake fluid. Something smelled funny when I came back out to leave, but seized wheel bearing wasn't the first thing that came to my mind. I sniffed around trying to find from whence the stench came, and on a visual inspection, everything was still attached. There was no smoke or fire, so I rolled on. 50 yards down the road, I went careening through a stop sign intersection to find the problem the hard way. It took 9 or 10 full mashes on the pedal before I got my brakes back. I had no idea that a wheel bearing could cause this kind of brake failure, but it sure can. Once I managed to stop, I got out and I touched the steel wheel and burned my hand on it. That's how I found it. So basically, if you boil your brake fluid inside the caliper, you create gas bubbles in the lines that displace the fluid, and that will prevent all of your brakes from working. Save for your e-brake, of course, because it's cable driven. I sort of felt the responsibility to share that with all of you, in case you had never thought about that sort of thing happening before. Anyway, I just need to pull the hub off of this axle and get this baked-on knuckle assembly removed. Everything was extra stuck and seized because of that extreme heat cycle. Even the lug nuts put up a fight. This is exactly the same equipment used in the Colt Knuckles video. Pry out the inner seal and then fight the snap ring out of the groove. Sometimes it can help to clamp it down, but I kind of enjoy chasing it around on the workbench. It's really not that bad once you get the snap ring started, but everything's greasy so it makes it a little tricky. The snap ring likes to pop back into the groove until you get your third hand on it. Use your other 2 hands to pry out the snap ring. If you have all the right tools to do a pressed-in bearing job, then that was really the hardest part. With the snap ring removed, you can pretty easily press the bearing out so you can install the new one. Here we have the same parts used in the Colt Knuckles video. National part numbers 513036 for the bearing and 225450 for the inner seal. I also picked up the outer seal on a separate order. It's part number 225230. From minivans to race cars, it's crazy how many different vehicles these fit. The bearing's about $50 and the seals cost $15 total. You want to know how to piss off a Honda owner with a broken wheel stud? You show them how easy you can just beat the 75-cent wheel studs out of a Hyundai or Mitsubishi hub assembly without pressing out and replacing the wheel bearing and seals. I suppose I didn't have to drive the studs out, but I did it anyway. I'm using a bearing splitter to clamp down on the cast hub assembly to support it in the bearing press. Steel always works better than wood to jig up the knuckle assembly in the press so that you can get a straight shot at the hub, but it's what I've got today. Grab a socket that's a little smaller in diameter than the center of the hub, and press that sucker out all the way through until it falls out. Next, flip the assembly over and grab a huge socket to press from the other side. I'm clearly not paying attention because I don't need the bearing splitter for this, but I'll figure that out in a second. See there? You'll need to rearrange your jig to support it from the underside because it takes a whole lot of pressure to press the bearing out of the knuckle. This is why using wood sucks to jig up a press. Luckily I brought some 1/4-inch thick angle irons with me to lay on top of the pile, and Chad had an extra trimmer blade laying around. Some people cut the outer race off of the hub, and I've done it that way, showed it in the other video. But today we're just going to use the knife edges of the bearing splitter to get behind the bearing race and press it off. Doing it this way takes less time, less effort, makes less noise, and you have less of a chance of damaging the hub by cutting too deep. Bearing splitter. Now clean up the races. It doesn't hurt to give it a final wipe down with a clean rag and some grease to make servicing it later easier, but I didn't. Sue me. We're going in dry. Start with the bearing. They love to get crooked going in, so you need to pay attention to the parts in your rigging to ensure that you can correct and straighten out an uneven load in order to avoid destroying everything. As long as you catch it early on, it's pretty forgiving to straighten it out. You just press from the high spot. Drive the bearing all the way in past the snap ring groove. Even though my bearing is pre-packed, I like to add a little extra grease before pressing in the outer seal. Grab your 225450 and press it in by hand. Next we need to mash in the hub. Eric the car guy told me to drive this thing in by placing the hub directly on the press and mash the knuckle down on it. And he was right. That was much easier than driving the hub down in from the top side. I suppose it works fine either way, but this way really is easier. What that saved me in rigging time on the press just justified driving out all the wheel studs. They're easy enough to put back in with a lug nut, a big nut, and an impact wrench. Here's a look at the old bearing's outer race. The ball bearings wore a trough all the way around the race, making it loose and sloppy. This is supposed to have a smooth, even radius on both sides of the part, not a groove with edges on it. The grease was burned up and contaminated, but this was a huge contributor to my car's poor cornering characteristics. As if the cut DSM springs, minivan knuckles, and turbo torque steer wasn't already enough to interfere with it. Now I just need to slap the snap ring in on the back side of the bearing and install the seal. It's pretty easy really. Start one edge, get at least half the ring situated inside the bearing bore, and give it a slap down in the groove. All's great. I'm going to exercise my grease addiction and add a little extra, and then it's time for the inner seal, or the axle seal, or the 225450. Whatever you want to call it, all those terms would be correct. All the first generation Eclipse, Talon, Laser, early 90s Gallants, Expos, Summits, and several Hyundai models all use the same exact parts as these, with little if any deviation. Cross-reference these part numbers I used here, and make sure your car's on the list. Normally I'd say that assembly is the opposite of disassembly here, but actually I'm not going to put this back together yet. I'm just going far enough to show you something practical that you can use. It's a time-saving technique that I'm going to catch a heck of a lot of grief for showing you on video. The person I learned this from is a professional mechanic who made a killing working commission, and he doesn't let people watch him work. He's going to be pissed. But anyway, my workbench is full of all the things you need to change all the things with all the stuff on this car. That's right, brakes and wheel bearings all the way around. I have all new hydraulic cylinders, seals, and even all the drum brake hardware to rebuild all of it. Whoa, suddenly my Elantra is levitating again. That ought to make it really easy to get to all four wheels. I'm going to spare you the front passenger side wheel bearing because I have a whole different video already devoted to that topic. I'm going to move on to the brake job to ensure that this car can handle simple commands like stop. There's an inspection hole that lets you see the health of the pads, and this isn't a very good angle to show you this. I'll get you a better view in a second on the other side. The brake caliper guide bolts allow the brake caliper to self-center and adjust its operating position as all of the brake parts wear. The brake pins are greased with rubber seals and O-rings. When you're replacing both the pads and the rotor, don't even bother with the brake caliper pins unless they're seized. Take the brake caliper bracket bolts loose instead. You have to take it off anyway in order to replace the rotor, and it saves you 4 bolts on the whole job. But if you weren't paying attention, you would have missed here the simple fact that I took 5 seconds to save myself the trouble of diagnosing the health of the brake caliper guide pins, and I did it while compressing the caliper so that the new brake pads and rotor would fit. Did you miss it? I'm telling you, he's going to be pissed. Just a screwdriver with one motion. Out with the old stuff, clean and install the new stuff, honk them down tight, and then go do the other side. So when you compress a caliper, you push all the fluid back up into the master reservoir. I always do a brake job with the brake fluid cap off and a rag wrapped around the filler neck. After each brake is reassembled, I pump them back up before moving on so that the next brake I service doesn't cause an overflow at the tank. It doesn't leave you with a mess to clean up. This isn't the orifice I want to leak brake fluid from. Use a rag before it leaks, and if it does, save yourself the mess and the time cleaning it up. So here we go again. Pay attention this time. I'm turning the wheel into the sunlight so you can get a better look in this hole at what I'm doing. There's the brake pad inspection groove, and I've got about 1/8 of an inch or 2.5 millimeters left on these semi-metallic brake pads. This one move determines if your caliper or guide bolts are seized as it compresses the caliper at the same time. If you know you're going to replace the brake pads, you can even pry against the pads themselves to ensure that the brake cylinder is fully compressed to fit over the new pads and rotors. How much time did that save you with a C-clamp? If any of these parts stick, it'll be obvious which one is to blame, and then you can take all those guide pins out and replace the seals, re-grease it, do the whole R&R job. But if everything compresses, why bother messing with any of that stuff? The grease that's in there clearly is doing its job. It's not until the rubber boot seals get damaged and let moisture in that they rust or stick, so leave the big C-clamp in your wood shop. Leave the pins in, don't mess with the seals, don't risk damaging them. But I think it's going to be nice having all new front brake rotors and ceramic pads. Even though the drag strip is a straight line, braking in the runoff lanes at my local track in this particular chassis traveling around 100 miles an hour is pretty terrifying. This car needs all the help it can get. This method is for calipers that don't require a twist reset, and your service manual doesn't say to do a brake job like this at all. That trick came from a guy that changed the rear drum brake pads and the drum on a 99 Chevy Cavalier in less than 40 seconds, using nothing but his bare hands in a shirt pocket. I've got to do my rear brakes too, but I lack the skills to teach you left-hand Suzuki method like he did it. I'm going to use tools for this. This is not the Shaolin garage for brake jobs, but at least my segways are rock solid. I'm rebuilding my whole rear axle, which is really just replacing the drums, brakes, and the wheel bearings. So we'll go through the basics first. If you're just going to repack your bearings, there's a trick to pull the inner seal. Once you've got the nut and outer bearing removed, leave the outer bearing out and put the nut back on, then yank the drum off. The nut will use the inner bearing to pull the seal, and the bearings don't fall on the ground to collect dirt. Some people install new studs in their drums. Some drums might even come with them. Mine didn't. So I'm knocking the old ones out and installing them into the new drums. This ball peen mini sledge 2-hammer trick saved me $8 and I didn't damage any threads. New drums are always coated in a thick layer of oil to prevent them from rusting before you get a chance to open the box. But before I knock the studs back through the drum, I need to install the inner bearing. With some creative hammering, you can save yourself a whole lot of time and trouble. First, I pack the bearings with grease, and next I use a big socket that's smaller than the bore in the drum, but big enough to mate flush with the inner bearing race. Once again, if it tries to go in crooked, shift the socket and hammer to the high spot and give it a good whack. Keep it straight and drive it home until it stops. A little extra grease and a seal later and you're done. You can use a socket to drive a seal in if you're really careful, but I really don't recommend it. I've got a little overzealous with the socket. The seal should be flush mounted with the bore so that it lines up with the seal boss on the axle and it doesn't leak grease out all over your brakes. You should use seal drivers instead of sockets wherever you can because it can keep you from driving all the way back to the parts store for a new $3 seal. I've never seen this much rust in the drum brakes of any car that pulled into a garage under its own power and managed to stop itself. The front shoe is wrecked. It's got nowhere near the required thickness it needs, and I'm shocked this car passed state inspection less than 100 miles ago. My only goal is to make this brake work as well as it can. All I need is the brake adjuster assembly. Everything else is getting replaced. Even though the wheel cylinder isn't leaking, they're only about $12 a piece and I bought both. Always crack the line loose first, then take out the bolts or you risk damaging the brake lines. I'm so focused on not damaging brake lines that I forgot to clean it up, my bad. For right now, I'm just hanging all 3 connections here loosely to prevent leaking brake fluid everywhere until I get the rest of this mess cleaned up. It's a good idea to squeeze the pistons of the new cylinder together while you attach the hydraulic line and snug it in place, because the less air that's inside this part is the less air you'll have to bleed out later. Installing a wheel cylinder like this can save you 5 minutes of pumping and bleeding brakes if you don't have a vacuum bleeder. It can save you a whole lot of pumping even if you do have one. Use anti-seize or brake grease on the contact points where the shoes meet the drum brake housing so they don't rust and stick together. Clean up the tensioner assembly parts you're going to reuse. Remove all the rust, scale, and dried up grease that's on it, and then begin your brake assembly. If you're not replacing the spring kit, you can use liquid solvents and a brush to do those parts. The replacement hardware kit for my car was $9. But anyway, grease up all the tensioner parts and assemble them. Attach the brake shoes to the housing with the retainer springs and pins, and attach the emergency brake cable. If your brake shoes didn't come with the emergency brake hardware pre-installed, then you need to make sure you put the right pad on the right side. The long shoe goes up the rear. Some of these retainers and pins can put up a fight. There are tools to help you install them more easily, and I have that tool, but it doesn't fit it. It's way too, it's huge. It's twice the size of these parts. These are the smallest drum brakes I've ever seen. You can fight with the rest of the brake springs with whatever you have, picks, pliers, screwdrivers, whatever helps you get them back through their proper holes. The points on the end of my brake reset tools are bigger than the holes that these springs clip into. We're living in the smartphone years now, not the 1-hour photo processing years. If you wanted to snap a bunch of pictures of these for reference, it doesn't cost you $25 to buy film and develop it. It's free. It's worth 1,000 words. It's in your pocket. Or you could just do them one at a time and not get your cell phone greasy. It's your choice. Once the brake parts are all snugly in place, you can replace the drum, and finally we get to pack and install the outer bearing. Rubber gloves are your friend here. You could do this with bare hands, but why? If you do, it's probably because you're out of gloves. The outer bearing is easy to install. All you have to do is hang the bearing on the axle, clean up the axle nut, and get your favorite lazy wrench of choice. Run the nut all the way down the axle until the bearing stops. Rotating the bearing while driving it helps you feel it bottom out. Then you should back off the nut and hand torque it to specification. In my case, that's 11 foot-pounds. And that feels great. Now for the grease cap. Clean all the old gunk out of there, give it a splat of extra grease, and tap it back into the hub. I'm going to show you that inner bearing trick again, because if your bearings aren't shot and you're not replacing your drums, you can do this $3 bearing repacking job. After you pull the drum off, dump the outer bearing and the nut in the palm of your hand. Put the drum back on and put the nut back on, but leave the outer bearing out. Pull the drum back off the axle, and the seal and the nut are hanging on the axle, waiting for you to remove them. It just saves time, money, and effort if you can reuse them, and it's a tidier way to work. After the inspection, if you've got good bearings, just repack them with fresh clean grease and replace that one inner seal. The bearings will last the entire life of the drums this way. It's a $3 preventative maintenance job that can save you $50 worth of bearings and somebody's sweat equity to replace them. Of course, if you're replacing new drums like I'm doing, you don't need to do this at all. This side is no better or worse than the other, but both were worn past their limits. And I'll be relieved once I've covered all the bases to make this car roll and stop properly, both on the street and on track day. I know that drum brakes are far less than ideal from a performance standpoint, and disc brakes would be a better upgrade for the way I'm using this car. In fact, someone previously posted that they knew how to do a disc brake upgrade on this chassis, and I can't for the life of me find that comment. For whomever that was, yes, I'm interested. I'm still expecting this car to be a little bit hard to stop when I'm done, but it will be a whole lot better because the rear brakes will actually work again. It will give me more confidence at the state inspector station as well, because that's overdue right now. These are the kinds of growing pains that you go through with a car that you're bringing back to running condition again. And it's always a ton of excitement when you build an engine and you fire it up for the first time. But immediately following that moment, that's when all the other gremlins and goblins show themselves. It's important for your safety to find and identify all those things. I was given one assignment when I received this car: see what it'll take. I didn't just run it until it wouldn't go anymore, I also ran it until it wouldn't stop anymore. It ran strong for over a year. To be completely honest, I never did anything to it except for add gas, 4 oil changes, install a stereo, install a windshield, replace 4 front tires, adjust the boost controllers, and then after about 2 dozen drag passes, I finally discovered how much it would take. After the engine failure, and for many reasons unknown, I decided to fix it. And now I'm taking it even further, so now I have to go through and look at all the rest of its systems a lot more seriously. I didn't just inherit an engine rebuild, I've inherited all of its wrinkles, its years of neglect, and all of its sun-dried junkyard goodness. It's my responsibility to make it a safe car again. My reason for replacing all the brakes and all the wheel bearings is because I don't know their service history. This helped me reset all variables, making them all equal. It cost me around $300 in parts for that peace of mind. If this car's making enough power to flex the frame and break windshields, I certainly don't want to risk testing its crash safety. After a quick cleanup, I now have the room to show you this. I finally bought the tool that I said I was going to buy in at least 2 of my other videos. It's a vacuum brake bleeder kit so that I can stop holding my breath and atomizing brake fluid using a siphon feed blowgun. This kit is between $30 and $40. From my experience, the glue that holds the box together is affected by humidity and by brake fluid, and it's my intention to store this tool in its original box, so I'm doing a quick tape job on the seam. Don't judge me, alright? Inside the box there's a vacuum pump with a gauge that reads inches of mercury. You get an assortment of hoses, 2 long ones and 3 shorties. I wish they coiled the tubing instead of creasing it, but oh well, anyway. All these pieces of hoses can be adapted to whatever kind of hydraulic system you need to bleed, whether you have 1 bleeder valve or 2. It includes those hose ends as well as a T so that you can connect them simultaneously. There's also a variety of fittings that can be used to adapt to hoses on the car and the hose ends included inside the box. But the part of the kit that makes it all work awesomely is the vacuum canister that captures your waste fluids. Some assembly required, of course. You need a short hose to attach to the inside of the lid for it, and that fits down into the canister to wrap fluids away from the vacuum side of the lid. The hose with the bleeder fitting goes on the side of the lid with the short hose. Why isn't this? Oh yeah, there's supposed to be a gasket. It has to be airtight to work. You then need to attach the other hose to the other port and squish that hose onto the end of the vacuum pump. Vacuum bleeder. Now let's put this thing to work. The first thing you need to do, and your highest priority to maintain, is keeping the brake reservoir full of clean brake fluid. If it ever runs dry, you have to start over from scratch. What's awesome about a vacuum bleeder is being able to turn a hydraulic service job into a one-man job. You just attach the bleeder hose, crack the bleeder valve open, pump up the vacuum, and then it pulls all the air and contaminated brake fluid into the canister. Nothing ends up on your garage floor, and now you don't have to feed someone a sandwich. The clear hose and the translucent canister let you see what kind of results you're getting. And that's some pretty nasty stuff right there. You must keep the brake master reservoir full. Must. You want to start at the wheel that's the furthest away from the master cylinder, as measured by the length of the brake line. Then go to the second farthest away, third farthest, and finally the closest wheel to it. If your car has ABS, you want to take special care not to let air get into the ABS pump or any of its valve bodies. There are specific procedures for cars equipped with ABS, and you should follow that manufacturer's recommendations and procedures for that model of car. This is what works on every car without ABS. Brake fluid is caustic. It will eat the paint off your car. Over time, it breaks down the rubber hoses and the rubber seals inside your brake system. That's what gives it that murky black color over time, because all those parts are black. You can always tell if the brakes have been well taken care of by the color of the brake fluid and how stained the master reservoir appears. Black is seals, brown is rust, and if you see fluid that looks milky and opaque, no matter what color it is, that's water. Smoky but still clear, normal. You can leave that alone, it's doing its job. The worst part about moisture in your brake fluid, aside from being a catalyst for corrosion, is that brakes generate heat. And whenever water turns to steam, it expands 16 times in volume. And in small quantities, it's enough to create gas bubbles that give you a spongy pedal. But what I experienced was enough heat and enough moisture to cause my brakes to fail entirely. No car's reservoir is 100% airtight. Brake fluid has a tendency to disperse any contaminants it absorbs throughout the entire hydraulic system. So just because your brake system holds pressure, it doesn't mean that water can't get deep into the system. Just the same, when a rear wheel cylinder fails, the fluid in the reservoir at the front of the car turns black. So periodically, it's a good idea to flush your system entirely. If you get brake fluid inside the vacuum pump side of your bleeder, there's a quick and easy fix to make sure you don't suck it up into the pump. You hold the hose vertically and press the vacuum release valve. It lets air in the hose so the brake fluid can flow back into the canister. It's normal for air to bubble in around the bleeder valve when you loosen it, and you'll see that in the line. So just because you're seeing air bubbles doesn't mean it's coming from your brakes. But you can see the quality of the brake fluid improve on each caliper from the first batch out that we've got here to the last. You can see the color change. You can see the transparency of the fluid in the hose improve. This is really hard to see when you're spraying it in a pan or squirting it all over the garage floor. A vacuum bleeder is a huge addition to any do-it-yourselfer's toolbox doing brake jobs because it drastically improves the quality of your work. Just make sure you keep that reservoir full. If you're lucky enough to have a friend with one hand out of his pocket, you could delegate that responsibility and knock this job out in minutes with one of these. It's even less work if you connect your siphon feed blowgun to the vacuum port and just spray it. Okay, so that was one of the Shaolin garage methods, but I wanted to show you that I was still willing to do the manual method with the pump. This should fix a lot of drivability issues. I've always felt like it was dragging a rear passenger wheel around, but it could have been the front driver's side all along. That should be fixed now because I replaced all of them. The emergency brake started sticking and it barely worked. That should be fixed too now. But I'm still experiencing a misfire, and there are a few things that I feel are still unfinished or poorly done on this car. I want to sort them all out so that I can have a smooth, trouble-free experience with it if I should choose to drive it to work again. It needs to reliably get me around, and maybe an occasional road trip. This isn't the car I want to take drag racing every weekend. I'm going to take a minute to talk about spark plug selection. A spark plug has two jobs: to ignite a fuel source and to pull heat out of the combustion chamber. There are 5 physical characteristics of a spark plug that you have the ability to change: electrode materials, type, heat range, projection, and spark plug gap. To change the first 4, you have to replace all of the spark plugs. Materials like nickel, copper, platinum, iridium, what have you, sometimes these electrode materials are specified by your engine manufacturer to match the design of your ignition coils or EGR system, and you have to use them. Whether they're single or multi-electrode plugs really makes no difference so long as it makes a hot and a big enough spark to start a gasoline and oxygen fire inside your combustion chamber. But multiple electrode hype makes for great marketing. When you hear people talk about heat ranges of spark plugs, it has absolutely nothing to do with how hot the spark is. What the heat range refers to is how well the insulator dissipates heat. A spark plug needs to burn hot enough to keep the electrodes clean, but cold enough that the electrodes don't melt or lose their conductive efficiency. There's a sweet spot. The heat range is determined by how much heat the electrical insulator can extract from the combustion chamber, and calling the ceramic part an insulator is confusing because ceramic is a dynamite thermal conductor. Remember that removing heat from the combustion chamber is the spark plug's second job. That's what the heat range refers to. Performance engines often require a colder heat range plug because extra heat is a side effect of making more power. The distance of the electrodes above the outer shell of the threaded plug references whether or not those plugs are projected. Projected plugs are more common as they elevate the spark plug deeper into the combustion chamber, allowing for a more even fuel burn. But there are cases where modifications to an engine affects the combustion chamber volume or the final compression in a way that make a non-projected plug a safer, more stable option. The last variable is the spark plug gap. I've always firmly believed that for performance reasons you should use all the gap your coils and compression ratios will let you get away with. Go too big here and you can produce a big weak spark, or one that's easily blown out in high final compression ratio conditions. There are also instances where frequent service or changing final compression ratios or making engine modifications or changing ignition coils allow you to make a different spark plug selection. I've done all of these things, so I'm experimenting a bit here. I'm using NGK BR7ES non-projected copper plugs that are one heat range colder than stock. I'm using non-projected plugs because of the extremely tight piston to valve clearances and the fact that the head and the block have been milled past specification with extremely shrouded valves. I'm also decreasing my spark plug gap to compensate for having a compression ratio nearly 3 full points higher than stock with 20 pounds of boost on factory coils. Make sure if you're changing any of your spark plug characteristics from stock recommendations that you have a justified reason for doing so. I've got beef with my turbo timer. Well, not really my turbo timer, but with the side effect of using it. In the airflow, fuel, and gauges video, I installed a relay that supplies battery power directly to my LC2 wideband oxygen sensor and my oil pressure, engine temperature, and voltage gauges. I triggered that relay with the radio power wire that comes on with the ignition switch. That was stupid. I should have powered it off the MPI circuit. Sure, the radio comes on with key on, but it shuts off when you turn the key off, instead of when the engine, ECU, and fuel supply turns off. So when my turbo timer's running, the O2 sensor reads 0 volts, which is a flood of fuel as far as the ECU is concerned, and my short-term fuel trims go extremely lean to compensate for it. You don't cool an engine off by running it lean, that's just not how it works. So I'm going to wire the trigger wire for the gauges into the factory fuel pump circuit. In a different video, I wired a relay that delivers battery power directly to the fuel pump, just like I did for the gauges, but I used the original fuel pump power circuit just to trigger that relay. Since I removed the electrical drain of the fuel pump, and since it now only triggers one measly relay, I figure it can't hurt to tap a second relay into the original fuel pump circuit now, can it? I mean, that makes sense to me, right? If it can power a fuel pump, certainly it can handle triggering both of these relays. Doing it this way makes my O2 sensor turn off with the fuel and the fire instead of with the key. The fuel circuit originates up front, closer to the relay. Sure, I heard the MPI relay clicking with the key. I just couldn't find it on this car, and I didn't feel like calling Jamie just so he could tell me where he hid it. So yeah, there's laziness playing a factor in my decision. But I also have a second set of wires that I need to pull back here anyway for a different set of plans that I have on the agenda. I want to install a few extra 12-volt DC electrical outlets in this car, and I have a few different reasons for doing it. One is that I'm tired of guests stepping over wires for the front and rear facing cameras, and the other is to modernize it a bit. Lots of stuff seems to need these outlets these days. Big Red has 3, so why not have 3 in my 25-year-old Elantra? I bought the outlets on Amazon for a couple of bucks a piece. I think I got the 5-pack for $8 shipped. So what if your $50,000 truck has 3 outlets? At that price, it should have over 30,000.
Why you gotta be all picking on me? Is there something wrong with all the luxuries I provide?
Luxuries, please. 3 12-volt outlets and that's called luxury?
What about the 120-volt grounded power outlet?
Big deal. I mean, I'm a 26-year-old Korean subcompact sedan and I can have a power outlet too. 250 watts. What you got?
That crusty old inverter? It probably doesn't even work.
Key on, fool. Anything can have a power outlet in it. A 12-volt outlet is 1960s technology. What you got on this antique?
Oh well, alrighty then. I suppose you're going to tell me you've got 4 power windows with child safety locks.
You've got that right, Lil Missy.
Powered mirrors with integrated lefty-righty switch as well?
Right again. You're gonna have to try harder than that.
4-wheel drive with automatic locking front differential and manually locking rear differential. Integrated trailer brake with bias control. Decline stability and tow haul mode.
Okay, I can concede you've got me there with your fancy towing and hauling capabilities, but I've got fancy buttons that you don't have.
Like what?
Like this fancy remote trunk popper button. Watch this. I know you've got more chunk in your trunk, but everything's manual. All I gotta do is push this button.
That doesn't seem to rival a 385 horsepower 4-wheel drive 5-liter V8 Coyote powered drivetrain with a locking rear differential.
Hey, I've got more buttons. Don't make me push this power button. My turbo and cams have already dyno-proven 357 all-wheel horsepower in another car. That's at the pavement. Don't make me push this power button and embarrass you.
I have a backup camera with reticles.
With what? With receptacles?
Reticles.
Rectals?
Reticles. They give you distance markings when you're backing up.
Well, I've got a front-facing camera and I've also got a rear-facing camera. They're both 1080 HD. They work all the time, not just when you're in reverse.
I've got voice-activated MP3 playback at the touch of a button.
Play hooker with a penis.
Playing song Hooker with a Penis.
So do I.
Play dirtbag.
I've got map lights.
I'm not lost, but, yes, I've got those too. Fancy pants.
I have a dome light. And well, mine works.
So you think you know right where to kick me, don't you? I tell you what, I don't just have a dome light. I've got a chandelier. And mine works too. Stuff that in your luxury pipe and smoke it. Ooh, burn. I'm telling you, Missy, you ain't got nothing on this antique. You didn't even come with a gas cap. How can you defend your MSRP when the manufacturer won't even include a gas cap? I cost less than $9,900 new and I came with a gas cap. Don't make me push this button.
Alright, you two. I know I completely instigated that. My bad. I had no idea they'd fight over my attention, but at least I can tell they're both mine because I know exactly where they get it from. With my electrical mods all buttoned up and all 4 wheels on the ground, I just need to torque all the lugs to 100 foot-pounds, torque the axle nuts to 165, and throw some cotter pins in it. Next stop after that is a state inspector, and then I've got a whole lot of testing and shaking down to do with the tune. I can't wait to use this new boost control solenoid. Hopefully now my electrical system is stable enough to hold a tune, and hopefully I can park the 2 of these cars outside together because I need this garage for other things right now. Anyway, I hope some of you out there found something in here that you can use. If so, click that like button and other people might find it too. Subscribe if you want to follow my progress. I'd like to take a minute to give special thanks to those of you who watched my previous video and became patrons to support not just my channel's production, but also my ability to be charitable to an organization that helps the people who saved my life 3 months ago. Your contributions enable me to create more content than I can currently afford to produce, and it's helping me send a big thank you back to the people who deserve it. For those of you who are unaware of what I'm doing with Patreon, please watch the previous video. It's a commitment to click it, but it's not your average fishing trip. If you think my videos are worth supporting and you want to see more, there's a contribution link on my channel page and in the description. Every little bit helps, and I thank you all for allowing me to do this. Until next time, stay tubed.